Good morning. I would like to welcome all the participants in this webinar on publishing in academic journals, which is part of the EURAXESS Latin America and the Caribbean and EURAXESS North America webinar series on how to get published. My name is Charlotte, and together with my colleague Victoria, we are the two coordinators of EURAXESS in Latin America and the Caribbean. I'm based in Rio de Janeiro, and she's based in Mexico City. Our EURAXESS colleagues, Jackson and Daria, support North American researchers and institutions from Washington, D.C., where they are based. I would like to thank our speaker, Victoria Babbit, who is Director of Research and Development and Outreach at Taylor & Francis. Victoria will give us a basic overview of the current state of academic publishing. In her name, I would like to thank the publisher Taylor & Francis, who is our partner to offer this series of 5 webinars to explore how to get published. Your questions must be submitted in writing in the GoToWebinar question section, Q&A section. The webinar will have a maximum duration of 90 minutes. It will be recorded and available on EURAXESS LAC and EURAXESS North America websites, as well as the slides. Well, before giving the floor to our guest, I would like to explain why this webinar. EURAXESS is an initiative of the European Commission that promotes and facilitates the mobility of researchers and their career development. When a researcher undertakes a mobility period, either for doctorate or postdoctorate or sabbatical, he or she will gain much more than just additional academic knowledge. You will probably learn a new language. You will discover a new working environment, meet colleagues from different countries, not only from Europe, but worldwide, with whom you will build trust and develop networks with which you will continue working and publishing all lifelong. It is proven that articles written in association with foreign researchers have more impact than those without international collaboration. As promoter of scientific collaboration, it seemed very relevant to EURAXESS to bring this series of events on publishing to support you developing your abilities. But this webinar is only one of EURAXESS activities in Latin America and the Caribbean and in North America. You can count on EURAXESS for everything that has to do with mobility. You can see on your screen our portal, which helps you looking for funding or job vacancies in research. You can also use EURAXESS to find a host institution to carry out your mobility in Europe. You can also find partners in Europe. You can get help preparing your arrival in a new country. But also with us, you get explanations to understand the European Commission funding and much more. Visit our EURAXESS Latin America and the Caribbean, but also EURAXESS North America websites and our social media to take advantages of all the opportunities that we identify for you. And get in touch. You can find our contact on your screen to explain your mobility project, and we'll be happy to support you. Now, I would like to introduce Victoria Babbit while she's sharing a screen. Victoria is the Director of Research Development and Outreach at Taylor & Francis. She joined Taylor & Francis in 2008, and through the past decades, she has supported societies, editors, authors as they navigate the rapidly changing publishing landscape. Prior to joining Taylor & Francis, Victoria was a postgraduate researcher within the field of geography, focusing on migration at the University of Washington in Seattle. Victoria, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much, Charlotte. And thank you to all of you who have joined us today. Just need to Click a few things away. Great. All right, it's a pleasure to be with you today, albeit virtually. In this session, we will be exploring different elements of publishing, of the publishing process, with a particular focus on open access publishing. As I believe Charlotte mentioned, if you have any questions, please write them in the chat box and I'll address them at the end of the session. So today we'll be doing a bit of polling as well, and we will be using Mentimeter. And the address is on the slide here. If you have an extra device with you, such as a mobile phone, I'd suggest opening Mentimeter on that device or just opening it up in another window of your browser. We'll be using the same code throughout the session. All right, hopefully you all can see this. So the first question here, I'm curious to know at what stage of your career you're currently at. So if you're a PhD student, if you're a postdoc, if you're a lecturer or assistant professor, associate professor, professor or other, and other can be master's students, it can be practitioner, it can be undergraduate student. Good, I think that gives us a pretty good picture. It seems to be stabilizing there. Wonderful. All right, so now I have another question for you. I'm curious to know where you are sitting today, where you're joining us from today. So just, you can type it in here. It's a word cloud. So we've got Brazil and Mexico dominating. We have someone close to me in Germany, a couple people in Germany, Russia. Wow, it's really quite the global mix here. Portugal, Washington, DC, Argentina. I'm going to move on to the next question here. And that is, I'm curious to know if you published before. So yes, multiple times, yes, only once, no, but I'm about to submit a manuscript for publication, or no, I'm just at the beginning of my research career. So we have some experienced people on the line. Great, it seems to be stabilizing there. So we've got people with quite a lot of experience. So hopefully this will be of use and help you in the future. Wonderful. I'm just going to switch back over to the slide deck here. Right. So I thought to start, it might be useful to take a look at the publishing landscape today. There are approximately 10,000 publishers today, with 5,000 of those indexed in Scopus. And those publishers are publishing over 33,000 active English language peer-reviewed journals. But keep in mind, there's another 9,500 plus non-English language peer-reviewed journals published today. And that number, and that number tends to grow year on year by about 3.5%. And those journals are publishing over 3 million articles per year, and that number tends to grow by about 3% year on year. However, we are seeing those growth rates accelerate in recent years. So we see about a growth of about 5% of new journals year on year, and a growth of about 4% of published articles year on year. And this, of course, is due to an increase in research and development spend, at least in part globally. And that investment into the research cycle is supporting anywhere between 7 to 9 million researchers. Now, the interesting fact that that I discovered is only 20% of those researchers are repeat authors. So 80% of people publish only one time in their career. Irrespective, as you can see, it's a really active landscape, and it's important to think through your research and publishing strategies if you would like to make an impact. And just to let you know, this is all the data from here comes from an STM report from 2018. So these numbers are actually a little bit out of date now. Now, one of the key ways of making an impact is publishing in the right journal or platform. Before you begin investigating possible journal options for your work, it's essential to spend time understanding the project you're currently working on and the audience you would like to reach. Throughout your career, you're likely to be involved in many different types of research, producing a variety of content. And typically people focus solely on the research article, but you may publish review articles, whether that's a literature review or a theory review or a systematic review. You might be interested in publishing position pieces or case studies or book reviews, which are a great way to get involved in publishing. Sometimes your work will be written for specialists in your field, but you may also choose to engage in public scholarship. So writing for the general public, or maybe you would be interested in, writing for policymakers. So do take the time to determine your objectives at the beginning. And when you begin investigating the appropriate place to publish, remember you're joining an ongoing conversation in your field. So you want to make sure that you're contributing thoughtfully to that conversation with something new. Oops, sorry. We're going to go back to Mentimeter. So if you go back to the Mentimeter site, the next question is, what qualities do you look for when selecting a journal? So what do you think about when you're looking at journals in terms of qualities? And this, of course, is a journal to publish in. So what qualities are important to you? It could be that it's a key journal in your field. Could be that it has really fast publication times. And it could be impact. Open access, yeah. Quick peer review is incredibly important, especially these days. Funding, it's a lot on indexing, various indexes, credibility, name recognition, lots of views. Yeah, usage is really important. You want people to find your work and read your work and hopefully cite your work. Name recognition. Oh, this is great. You're really capturing a lot. Response time, international, interdisciplinary. Great. And open access. Fantastic. All right. I'm going to jump back to the slide deck now. Great. Well, I think you've captured many of the different qualities that are important. And there are many different qualities to take into consideration when choosing a journal. And I've listed some of them here, which many of you picked up on in that discussion. So I'll start off with age. A well-established journal with a good reputation is a safe bet. However, that doesn't mean that you should ignore new or recently established journals. They may be publishing cutting-edge research, or they may be using really interesting publishing models. So open access was mentioned a few times there. The thing is with new journals, you just want to really make sure you take the time to do your research on the journal, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a few minutes. It can also be helpful to look at the history of the journal. Has it published key research or research from really key thinkers in your field? Does it publish on time? Affiliation may be important. Is it a journal of an important society or an important institution? Is it published by a trusted publishing house? Scope is key. Whether the journal is interdisciplinary, is it a niche journal? Does it publish across broad subject matters? Is it, a mega journal? All of this will be outlined in the aims and scope statement on the journal website. And then who reads the journal? Is it practitioners, or is it a global audience or a local audience? Again, there's no right or wrong there. It's just depending on that individual project you're working on in the current moment. Now, impact probably had the most votes on that slide. And of course, it can be measured in a number of ways. Most people focus on the impact factor. That's been a metric that's been around for a long time, and it's been used as kind of shorthand for quality, whether you agree with that or not. But there might be other factors that fall within that rubric of impact. So the importance in your particular academic community, which that might not line up with an impact factor. It might be a good source for teaching, etc. I mean, there's a lot of different things you can look at in terms of impact. The most important thing is that you understand what is valued in your institution and in your field in terms of impact. Now, editorial boards will give an indication of what type of research the journal is interested in receiving. Boards are built to reflect the ambitions of a journal. So for instance, if they have been publishing in a certain area for a long time, but suddenly they want to start drawing in content from a new kind of emerging area of research. They are going to try and find someone who's a specialist in that area to bring on board, so that person can act as an ambassador for the journal, help to bring in that new research, but also to help to run the peer review process, because of course they'll know the specialists in the field. The same goes for geography. You know, if they're interested, if a journal's interested in receiving more research from Brazil, they're probably going to try and find a specialist in Brazil to join the editorial board. Now, publishing model we're going to talk about a bit today. It's becoming increasingly important, but I'll just park that for a moment. Peer review style may be important to you. This information will always be available on the instructions for authors, and I'll be talking about peer review a little bit more in depth later. And then many journals do post their rejection rates, not all do, but the rejection rate will give you an indication of the competition level of the journal, but so will many of these other factors that I've listed here. So some or all of these characteristics may be important to you when you're choosing a journal. Still, it can be really challenging to choose a journal even after taking into consideration all those characteristics. However, there are tools out there to help. So at Taylor & Francis, we have what we call a journal suggester, which will match your abstract with potential journals based on the journal's aims and scope statement. So you cut and paste your abstract into the white field there, and then click on reveal suggested journals, and you will be given a list of journals that you can kind of investigate further to see if they truly are a good fit. Now, our advice is to select a few journals that are a good fit for your work and rank them from your #1 choice downward. And when it's time to submit your manuscript, start with your #1 choice. And if for some reason they're not interested in publishing your manuscript, move to #2, and so on and so forth until you are successful in getting your article published. It's all about having a really clear strategy at the beginning of the process. Now, as I said, I'm going to focus a bit on open access today. So just to make sure everyone's on the same page, I thought we'd start with the basics. So there are two essential elements to open access. The first is making content freely available online to read. And then the second is about making the content reusable by a third party after publication. And I'll briefly discuss both of these. People use many terms to discuss varieties of open access. So you've likely heard of green open access. You may have heard of platinum or diamond open access. And sometimes people refer to bronze open access, which isn't truly open access in the true sense. Today, we are going to focus on gold open access. And gold open access essentially entails making the PDF or the version of record freely available online. And there are two ways in which an author can publish open access with Taylor & Francis, or most publishers, to be frank. Either in a fully open access journal or in what we call a hybrid journal. Fully open access journals publish all of their content in an open access format. These journals aren't funded by subscription, so instead, most charge what's called an APC, or article publishing charge. However, many journals are funded by societies or institutional agreements. And in those cases, either the author does not have to pay, or they may pay a really reduced fee. All of this information should be clearly detailed on the journal website under the instructions for authors. And make sure to talk to the folks at your university and at your funder, because often funders and institutions do cover the charges for open access publishing, especially if they're requiring it. Now, hybrid open access is when an author chooses to publish open access in a journal that is subscription funded, and much of their content is not freely accessible unless you or your institution has a subscription. And these journals charge an APC to cover the cost of that one open access article. However, again, many institutions and consortia have agreements with publishers to cover those APC costs for hybrid journals. So again, check with your institution, with your librarians to see what options you have. Right, so let's pop over to Mentimeter again. And we'll go to the next question, which is, Why would you choose to publish your work open access? So the first is that your funder or institution requires it. Second, it's important to make all of my research freely accessible. Third is to increase impact. And then lastly, I don't plan on publishing open access. So you can rank these from the most to least important to you. So it looks like for the majority of people, it's important to make all their research freely accessible. I find number 1 and 2 usually kind of do a dance with each other for a while until one wins. It's either impact or that people feel it's important to open up the research ecosystem. Great. All right, I'm going to pop back over to the presentation. So what are the benefits of publishing open access in an open access journal or platform? Well, as many of you listed, it's important to people to have their research as open as possible and as accessible as possible. But from our perspective, what we've seen is the main benefits are greater visibility, and with that potentially greater impact, both within the research community and the broader public, because of course everyone has access to your work. And the access, visibility, and impact can spur innovation and collaboration. So at Taylor and Francis, we've seen that open access articles typically receive substantially more citations. So we see about a 32% increase in citations and greater readership with over 6 times as many downloads of those articles. And increasingly, in many countries, regions, and institutions, open access has become a requirement, or at least strongly encouraged. And as I mentioned earlier, usually when it is required, support is made available at the institutional level or via funding bodies in many cases. Great, so the second element of open access is how your work can be used by others after publication. If you publish your work in an open access manner, you will be asked to choose a Creative Commons license, which describes how people can use your work in the future. Some journals don't give you a choice on which type of license you can use, so it's really important you investigate prior to submission if you have any concerns. So here are the typical licensees that you're going to come across. The first is CC BY, and this license allows authors to use your work in any way they choose as long as they clearly attribute authorship and original publication. So this is usually the default license for pure open access journals. The next one is CC BY NC. And here an author can use your work in any manner, but they can't profit from it. So the NC stands for non-commercial. For instance, they can't include your article in a book that they would subsequently charge money for. And the next one is CC BY ND. And here an author cannot change your work in any manner, in any way. They must use it in the original form. For instance, this would mean that they couldn't translate your work into another language and then publish it. And then lastly, I've included CC BY SA. And this means that when people use your work, they need to attach the same license as you did. And this is, of course, really important for you to be aware of when you're using other people's work that's published in open access format. With the rise of open access, we have seen an emergence of what are called predatory publishers or predatory journals. And I can imagine that some of you have been contacted by these publishers who show enthusiastic interest in your work and ask you to submit to the journal. The websites often have journal names that are similar to well-respected journals, or they might feature information that's incorrect or slightly misleading, such as stating they have a global impact factor. And here are some other characteristics of predatory journals. They often have hidden or unclear author fees. And that's why I stressed earlier that any information about APC should be clearly presented on a journal website. It shouldn't be a surprise to you at the end of the process. You shouldn't get an invoice without knowing about the fees ahead of time. Of course, you do need to do your due diligence and look at those instructions for authors to make sure that you know what the requirements are. They tend to lack quality peer review of articles by experts in the field, and they tend to guarantee really fast acceptance or publication time. So they'll talk about 1 week or 48 hours. And for any of you that have gone through the peer review process, you know that that's very unrealistic. So if you want your research to be read and respected by others in your field, either locally and or internationally, it's really important to avoid publication in these fake journals. En masse, they erode the credibility of all the research published in them. But luckily, there are some great resources out there to help you make sound decisions about where you would like to publish if you're interested in publishing in an open access journal. The first resource is Think, Check, Submit, and this is a cross-industry initiative which is aimed at researchers to help them make informed choices and to choose trusted journals to publish their research in. So Think, Check, Submit created a toolkit, which is basically a kind of set of questions for you to ask of a journal. And it helps you identify those high quality journals which would be appropriate for submitting your research to. And you know, by going through that process, you can protect yourself against fraud and publishing malpractice. The second resource is the DOAJ, and this is a database for open access journals. The journals in this database have been screened thoroughly to ensure that they are legitimate. However, like many databases, there does tend to be an assessment period. So even if a journal is legitimate, it's a new journal, it might be legitimate, there might be a period of time where it's not showing in the DOAJ. And in those cases, you'll need to make sure that the journal in question is published by a respected and trusted publisher. And that's where OASPA, this last organization, can be of help. OASPA is an organization for publishers and service providers working with open access. Members here need to meet a certain standard to be included as part of the organization. So if the journal you're interested in publishing in is not included in the DOAJ and the publisher is not a member of OASPA, you should really proceed with extreme caution and talk to your colleagues and talk to your librarians. Librarians tend to have a really good understanding of the key publishers out there. So today we won't be doing a writing workshop, but I do have some simple guidance for you to consider while preparing your manuscript. The first piece of advice I have for you is think like an editor. Put yourself in their shoes. Make it easy for them to read and enjoy your work. You need to understand, depending on the size of the journal, an editor can receive anywhere from 50 to well over 1,000 submissions a year that they need to assess. So you need to make sure that yours stands out. And here are some basic tips to help you make your argument easy to read and understand. Write first and edit later. This helps you to create a through line in your paper. That's, that line that's going to hold all these different parts together. And remember, simplicity is key, especially when you're dealing with complex problems or complex theories. So think about your sentence structure and your use of passive voice. I used to recommend to my students to limit their sentences to about 2.5 lines, because once you get to that third line, as a reader, you start to lose track a little bit. And the same is with passive sentence construction. Sometimes you need to use a passive sentence, especially in method sections, but make sure that you're mixing it up a little bit. So if you have created a passive sentence, that the next sentence maybe is an active sentence. The goal is to make it as easy as possible for the reader to understand your arguments and your evidence. And the most important strategy to achieving this is creating a clear and easy to follow structure for your paper. Irrespective of discipline, most academic papers follow this model. It's especially important that you create a strong introduction. So that's 2 to 3 pages that establishes the research question or problem you're exploring, provides a clear thesis or argument, which is easy to see and understand, and really make sure your argument stands out. Don't bury it in the middle of the second page and the third paragraph. It should be really prominent. You should also provide an outline of the structure of the paper, letting readers know what they can expect. And that would be obviously your methods or theory section, your results, your discussion, and your conclusion. Lastly, your role is that of a storyteller. It's up to you to give life to the exciting story of your research, so be brave and be bold. Once you publish, you would of course like people to be able to find and read your work. And this begins with the basics, the first elements of your article that the potential readers will see. That's the title and the abstract. And title styles and format can vary somewhat depending on subject area and individual writing style. However, there are some basic tricks to keep in mind when composing your title. First of all, write the title after you've written the paper. Though if you struggle with titles like I used to, it's not a bad idea to have a little sheet of paper to the side where you can jot down ideas as you write. Titles should really be fairly concise, so keep it short and to the point. We recommend around 16 words or fewer on average. And in the title, avoid any jargon or abbreviations. It should be the simplest explanation of what your paper is. So you don't want anything that might be confusing or that certain people might not be aware of. And do include some of the essential terms from your paper and make sure to feature those at the beginning of your title. It really helps with search engines when people are looking for work in that subject area. An abstract. So why are abstracts important? Well, one of the things about abstracts that I think a lot of people don't understand is oftentimes reviewers will take a look at an abstract and based on the abstract make a decision on whether or not they're going to review the paper. So it's really important that your abstract is solid. Abstract should tell the reader what the article is about. They're like mini film trailers for your article. It should give a sense of what the story is about without providing all the small details. And again, here are just a few things to take into consideration when writing abstract. Like with the title, it's difficult to write an abstract before you actually finish writing the paper, as the abstract is the overview of the content. You want to make sure to take the time to understand the parameters of the particular journal you're going to be submitting to. Some journals have really particular guidelines around their abstracts about format and structure, and most journals do have word counts for abstracts. And with an abstract, take the time to think about who your potential audience is, who you actually want to reach, and write it for them. So for instance, if you're hoping to engage with practitioners, you might use slightly different language than if you were looking to engage with people who are deeply embedded in your research area within academia. And often people use unnecessary words in their abstract. I always think of it as kind of the writing warm-up. So you might start with "in this paper" or something similar, and have little filler words throughout. After you've written your first draft, and just do a free write, go through and remove any of these unnecessary words or phrases so you end up with a really tight and concise abstract. And if you end up revising your paper after you've written the abstract, which you will during the peer review process, make sure to go back and review and revise your abstract so that it matches with that new version of your paper, because you might have changed significant things in the paper that aren't reflected in your abstract anymore. And lastly, take some time to read it out loud and have others read it for fluency. If your abstract is difficult to read, it's unlikely that people are actually going to click through to read the article because they will likely assume that the article is going to be poorly written. Okay, before we discuss the process further, I'd like to just take a moment to highlight some of the ethical issues that we're seeing on a regular basis. And I have to say, issues around publishing ethics are seemingly on the rise, or it could be that we're just getting better at identifying breaches, or people are alerting us to problems a little bit more often. And here's some of the issues that we see on a regular basis. And I should say this is just a partial list. We could easily have a full session today on publishing ethics. So I'm just going to focus on 3 of the most common issues we deal with across disciplines. And that is authorship issues, duplicate submission and publication, and then plagiarism and text recycling. Authorship disputes are quite common, and they tend to slow down the peer review and production process, because when an issue arises, we just stop the process and ask the authors to resolve it and come back to us with a written agreement. And often the issues have to do with disagreements over who's included on the authorship line, the sequence of names, or who's responsible for different parts of the process. So to avoid any problems, it's extremely important that you have a written agreement at the start of the process between all of the authors regarding responsibilities, the sequence of names on the authorship line, and what journal you're submitting to. So apart from the standard authorship disputes, here are 3 distinct issues that we see on a regular basis. The first one is ghost authorship. And this is when a significant contribution to a manuscript has been made by someone without acknowledgement of that contribution. So their name doesn't show on the authorship line. And this is obviously an issue because we cannot know if there's a conflict of interest there. The second issue is guest authorship. And this is when authorship is granted to an individual who didn't contribute it to the paper in any way because of their seniority or their reputation or their supposed influence in the field. And this has been a common practice in some institutions, but anyone on the authorship line should have made a significant contribution to the paper, as they'll be held responsible for it in the future. And lastly, we have authorship for sale, which is kind of an emerging issue that we're dealing with. There have been quite a number of cases where individuals or predatory publishers, or more often than not, paper mills, offer to add an author's name to a paper after it's been accepted, but they charge for this. And these actors are obviously playing on the desperation of scholars who are under so much pressure to publish more and more articles every year to progress in their careers. So who qualifies as an author? I've listed the main qualities here, and I just want to note that it's not or between these different bullet points, it's and. Any listed author is a representative of the published paper and should have in-depth knowledge about all aspects of the study as published. So that's the rationale, the methodology, the analysis, and the interpretation. This is a rule that many early career researchers are surprised by, at least I was when I was in grad school. Why might it be a problem to submit to more than one journal at a time? Well, when you submit your paper to a journal for a peer review, you are committing to publishing your article in that journal if they accept it. And they in turn will use their time and their resources to review your paper and help you improve it. And there can only be one published paper. You can only publish a paper once. There can only be one version of record. This is fairly easy to detect because often when papers are sent to the same reviewers, who then alert editors and publishers that they're reviewing the same paper for 2 different journals. And this can often happen because there wasn't a clear agreement between on roles and responsibilities between the co-authors. Hence, 2 of the co-authors accidentally submit the paper to 2 different journals. But I have to say, editors are becoming a bit less forgiving and oftentimes just withdraw the paper in question from peer review. So be really careful on this one. Now, sometimes it is okay to submit work that has been presented elsewhere. You just need to be honest with the editor about the previous presentation or publication or posting. Transparency is key in this process. For instance, if you've published an article in another language but would like to publish it in English, you just contact the editor of the journal you'd like to publish with and ask them if they would be interested in publishing a translation. You also need to go back to the publisher of the original publication to make sure that they will allow you to publish a translation. Now, it might not be a problem. Everyone might be happy with that arrangement, or it might be that the journal you're interested in publishing with doesn't publish translations, but maybe they recommend another journal. Similarly, with data presented at conferences, it's not unusual to publish an article that's based on content presented at a conference. You just need to make sure that you clearly state that the data or an earlier version of the paper was presented at a conference. This is obviously a really common practice within academia. And lastly, we have preprint servers. Preprint servers no longer are an issue for most journals. Again, you need to cite the original posting of your article, let the editor know that a version of your paper can be found in an archive or repository, and provide the link. And then once your article that has been published, you need to go back to that repository or preprint server and add the link to the version of record. And lastly, we have originality. So originality issues are also becoming easier to detect. Most journals use software now to measure incidences of overlap with previously published work. Most of you know that if you use someone else's ideas, processes, or words, you need to clearly cite them in the paper and provide a full reference to their published work. This is true of all content. So this is even kind of non-published content in the traditional sense, such as websites, blogs, and that sort of thing. Any kind of material you're using. What many are less aware of is the need to cite their own work if you have used it in your paper. So if you're using the same ideas that you previously published on, make sure to cite it because they will show up in an originality check. Now, following on from that, we are seeing a rise of text recycling, often called salami slicing. And this is when you use the same ideas, data, and or words excessively to the point that it's not offering any new insights or contributing anything new to the literature or field. So an example of this would be if you had a research project that really should have led to 2 articles, but you try and squeeze 4 articles out of it. So the 3rd and 4th article probably aren't adding anything new besides 2 more publications for your list. Really, anything you publish should be original content and pushing the research field forward in some way. Right, okay, so once you're ready to submit, there are a few steps you should take. First of all, it's a good idea to review what has already been published in your journal of choice. You may find work that's relevant to your own. And if you do find work that intersects with that current article you're working on, do reference those previously published articles. Again, you're joining a conversation. So if your topic has been covered in that journal, it's really good to kind of nod to those earlier contributions, but only cite things that are relevant to your work. You want to make sure that your work matches the aims and scope of the journal. These statements describe the journal's mission and the type of research they're interested in publishing. Editors spent a good deal of time crafting these statements so that readers and librarians and authors understand exactly what the journal is about. And one of the main reasons manuscripts are rejected is because the research didn't fit within the aims and scope of the journal. You'll find the aims and scope statement usually on the journal landing page, or if it's not on the landing page, there will be a link on the landing page to those aims and scope statements. Also, do take the time to read and follow the instructions for authors. So I've got a little example of it on the side there from one of our journals. These will provide you with guidance on how to format your paper, the word counts, any other kind of information about types of content they accept, peer review styles, and they will provide information on any relevant charges. So whether that's ABC charges or possibly page charges or maybe submission fees. And lastly, just a quick word about language. I get this question a lot, should we send our work out to language editors before we submit? And I've asked a lot of the editors I've worked with in the past, what their, thinking was on this. And I found that most editors are happy to look at a paper as long as they can understand the argument and the methods that were used. The language doesn't have to be picture perfect. However, do try and have someone who has experience with publishing take a look at your paper and check for language, read it through a few times for language, just to make sure that it's fluid and that it's understandable. If you do feel that you need language editing prior to submitting, you'll find that a lot of publishers like TNF do offer language editing services. Of course, it is for a fee, but you can find that information on the websites if you do need help there. And just a few more things to keep in mind. First of all, in most cases, you'll be submitting to an online submission system. So make sure to take the time to understand what kind of submission system, peer review system the journal uses so that you're a little bit familiar with it. And then make sure that you have all the files that you're going to need to submit on hand. If you're using any images or data that's not yours, make sure that you've obtained permission. This is your responsibility. And then I've mentioned this already, but to avoid any problems or mistakes, make sure that you have an agreed upon plan with your co-authors on who is responsible for what and which journal you're submitting to. And also be certain that you have their correct information, including the preferred spelling of their name, recent, the most relevant email address, and their affiliation. And then lastly, I know this sounds silly, but make sure the version you submit is the final version and not an earlier draft. This actually does happen, and you don't want to wait through that peer review process only to have your paper rejected, to open up the file and realize you submitted the wrong draft of your paper. So take 5 to 10 minutes to make sure all your files are the most up-to-date files and the most relevant files. Right, so now we're going to pop over to Mentimeter again. And this is a free text question. So why is peer review important? Why do you think it's an important part of the process? Ensure quality, absolutely. Unbiased, impact, relevance, credibility, scientific quality, relevance. Oh, I like that credibility is the dominant one there. Relevance. They move around so quickly, it's hard to read them. Improvement. Build science, yeah. Oh, accessibility, that's interesting. Validation, yeah. Transparency. New ideas. Oh, there's a lot of good stuff here. Great. So relevance, quality, credibility, validation seem to be the dominant ones here today. Great. I'm just going to pop back to the slide deck again. So I'm going to take a few minutes to talk about what peer review looks like in practice. And I mentioned earlier that there are different types of peer review you're likely to come across in your career. And the first is called single blind peer review. And this is when the peer reviewer knows the identity of the author, but the author doesn't know the identity of the peer reviewer. And this is probably the most common model that you're going to find in science, technology, and the medicine disciplines. Whereas the second type is double blind peer review. And this is where all the identities are hidden. And this tends to be the most common within arts and humanities and social sciences. And then lastly, we have open peer review, which is really on the rise now. And this is when all identities are known. And what I'll say about open peer review is there's a lot of variation in there. There was a study recently, and I think there were over 100 different types of open peer review. So you have the most basic version where everyone knows who everyone is. But then you have really open peer review where the whole process is opened up, as with F1000 Research, which is our new platform that's joined us. And that peer review process, people can follow along the peer review process from the preprint to acceptance and be able to read the reviewers' comments. There's the ability for the community to comment on the paper. You see the different versions of the paper. So there's a wide range of models there. So if you are interested in open peer review, make sure that you understand what you're getting yourself into, you know, what kind of open peer review they're practicing. And that, again, will be information that you can find on the instructions for authors. And here are the main roles involved in the peer review process. So the editor will assess the article to see if it's a good fit for the journal in terms of content and quality. And then the editor selects reviewers, although sometimes they assign a manuscript to other board members, especially if it's a large journal covering a lot of different subject areas. And those board members then would go find peer review external reviewers. And then once the editor receives the reports from reviewers, they will make the final decision regarding publication. Now, the peer reviewers read and assess the article and any data that they've included. And most journals have 2 to 3 external reviewers assess a manuscript. And some journals even have special reviewers that look at statistics and this sort of thing. The reviewers will write a short report with suggested additions and changes for the author, and then they provide a recommendation for the editor regarding a publication decision. And then lastly, we have the journal staff, and these folks often are part of the publishing house, and they're responsible for the system that is used for the peer review process. They will do technical checks on the manuscripts coming in, and then they also are responsible for any communication between authors and editors and peer reviewers, and they're there to help if there are any technical issues with the peer review platform. So if you're having difficulties uploading your file for some reason, you would be in touch with those folks. And here's an overview of how peer review works in most cases. So your manuscript is submitted to the journal, and it goes through an initial check to see that everything's in order. And if it's not formatted correctly, or if it's missing files or other components, it will be returned to you with instructions on what to do. And then once the files are in order, the submission is sent to the editor for a quick review. The editor will decide if the paper should be sent out to peer review. At this stage, it can be rejected if it's out of scope of the journal, if it's not complete, if it's unreadable or not understandable. And this is called a DES reject. Now, if the paper is of interest, the editor will send it out for peer review, usually to 2 or more external reviewers who are specialists in that particular field. And they will read the work and provide a report for the editor with a recommendation for a decision. And the most common recommendations are revise and resubmit, either with major revisions or with minor revisions. So if you have a revise and resubmit with major revisions, that means there's still quite a lot of work that you need to do on your paper, but there's something they like about your research project. If it's minor revisions, then it means the paper's pretty much ready to go, but there's a few just small things that you need to fix. Either way, a revise and resubmit is a win. You should celebrate if you get a revise and resubmit. This means they're interested in your work, but they just have some suggestions on how to make that. The paper can also be rejected at this point. And then I've included accept here with a star. It is possible that your paper will be accepted without revisions, but it's highly unlikely. And I always tell the story of Eugene Fama, who won the Nobel Prize for Economics a few years ago. And I live in Stockholm, so I'm able to go to the Nobel Lectures. And I went to the Nobel Lectures for Economics, where he was presenting the paper he published on the research that led him to win the Nobel Prize. And he's presenting his papers, and to be perfectly honest with you, I didn't follow a lot of it because it was advanced mathematics, but he was presenting his paper, and at one point in time, he steps back and goes, huh, you know, I think that's one of the only papers that was ever accepted without revisions. So here's a man in his mid-70s presenting a paper that led him to win the Nobel Prize in economics, and it was one of his only papers accepted without revisions. So that's just to say, every piece of writing can be improved upon. It's just part of the process. Now, once you make the revisions, you will resubmit to the editor, who will either accept it or they'll send it out again to the reviewers to see if they're happy or if they have other comments. Now, here's the bad news. Your paper can go through that process a couple of times and still be rejected, but I'll give you some tips on how to avoid that in just a moment. So responding to reviewers' comments is one of the most important parts of the publishing process besides writing your actual article. At times when you receive a reviewer's report, it can feel like a rejection, especially if you get a revise and resubmit with major revisions. But try not to become too upset. If you are upset, just close your computer, go into the kitchen, pour yourself a cup of tea, a glass of wine, whatever your medicine is, and forget about it for a couple of days. And then when you're ready to get to work, carefully read the decision letter that the editor sent. It may include some advice on how to respond to the reviewer's comments, especially if the reviewers are suggesting different things that are in conflict. And it will definitely provide information about deadlines for returning your revisions. If you have co-authors, set up a meeting to review all the reviewers' comments. Make certain to share the reports with everyone prior to your meeting, including that note from the editor. And then when you come together, go through the reviewer reports and make a list with all of their suggestions for improvement. And you may want to kind of group them by category, so literature review or methods or discussion, whatever is easier for you. And once you have your list, go through each of the items and decide which recommendations you would like to adopt and make those changes in the document. Now, here's the key to avoiding the fate of going through the revisions process a couple of times and still being rejected. When you send back your revisions to the editor, you must include a note to the editor, clearly detailing how you have addressed the peer reviewer's concerns. So, where you've adopted the peer reviewer's recommendations, clearly detail what you have changed and where that change can be located in your paper. So, include the page and the line number. Now, some journals welcome the use of track changes to help editors and peer reviewers see what you've done, but even though you've used track changes, you still need that note to the editor talking through what you've done. Now, you're not going to agree with all the peer reviewers' recommendations. That's natural. In that case, you need to clearly and respectfully explain why you chose not to amend the paper. So be really specific, as clear as you can be. For instance, if the peer reviewer thought you should cite another paper, but you feel it's out of scope of your project, explain why that is, so both the peer reviewer and the editor understand. Now, once you've detailed how you've addressed each of the peer reviewers' comments, review your response to the editor, make sure you've included all the recommendations and the actions that you've taken, that you've done so in a clear manner, and that the letter is professional and devoid of any frustration. It can be a really challenging process. Sometimes I think it can be probably an emotional process for some folks. So it is understandable that you may become a bit frustrated. It's just important that it doesn't influence your communication with the editor. Most importantly, remember to be respectful and professional during this process. This is your community, your future network. So you may end up submitting to the journal again. You may be asked to peer review articles. You may want to become a board member on one day, or you may want to collaborate with the individuals that are reviewing your paper. Keep all of this in mind during the process. And just remember, the editor and the peer reviewers are trying to help you publish the very best version of your work. Peer review is a gift. I mean, granted, it can be a somewhat painful gift at times, but it is truly a gift. All right, so one more quiz on the Mentimeter site. What do you think are the top reasons for that articles are rejected? It always takes a couple minutes to load. Fit and scope, weak contribution. Not original. I always thought not original would be the top one. Not meeting deadlines, repeating existing points, scope, scope, poor, redaction, field wrong, bad quality, out of scope. Not clear information, the writing, the conclusions are not correct or well written. Early career authors, that's interesting. Out of scope, poor language skills, plagiarism issues, envy. Don't follow the guidelines, lack of relevance, nothing original, unclear ideas. Inconsistency. Oh, there's a lot of great stuff here. Scope, methods, so what? Yeah, good, great stuff. All right. Well, I have to say that I think you have captured most of the things that our editors have told us over the years. So we have asked this of our editors over the years, you know, what are the top reasons? And the top reason is that it was sent to the wrong journal. It doesn't fit the aims and scope. So again, remember to carefully read the aims and scope of the journal and look at what's been previously published to make sure that your work is going to fit. And number two, not a true journal articles. So either it was written in a journalistic fashion, or that, you know, clearly somebody was trying to take a chapter and turn it into an article but didn't succeed. So again, it comes back to that whole process of understanding what sort of writing project you're undertaking and researching the best platform or the best method to communicate your work. Number three is pretty easy. This is all about following the instructions for authors. They will always tell you what the criteria is for any type of article that they accept. And I tend to group number 4 through 9 together because I think the medicine for this is the same, and that is workshopping your paper as much as you can. Share your work as much as you can before you submit. Have trusted colleagues read and comment, and find those colleagues that will give you tough critical feedback that's designed to help you improve your work. So the ones with the red pen, not the ones that are going to pat you on the back and say, wow, that's great. And do try and present your work as much as you can outside of your community, whether that's at an international conference or a regional conference. That's one great thing about this past year, is that the conferences have been a bit more accessible since we don't have to travel. And then the other thing that I would recommend on this point is something that we did in my program, and that is we had a work group that met once a month. And it was an interdisciplinary group. I'm from the, come from the social sciences. So it was folks from all the different disciplines that would meet once a month, and we'd read one person's paper and give them feedback. And what was great about this group was, number one, you're getting a lot of diverse feedback about your work. But the other thing was the group was comprised of people at different stages of their career. So you had people, just starting their PhD, but then you had tenured professors that had published numerous times. And what was really useful, I think, especially for those of us just starting out, was to see these very well-established academics struggle with the writing process. And it just was really good to understand that everybody struggles with it. It's hard to communicate your findings. This is not an easy process. So if you have the opportunity to do that, I highly recommend it. And then the last one here, obviously, avoid at all costs. So before I finish today, I'd just like to highlight a couple resources that you can explore on your own. The first is our How Researchers Change the World podcast and learning program. And with the podcast, every episode features one researcher and one piece of research that shaped the way that we think today. So you'll hear the story behind the research direct from the researcher. They'll tell you why the topic was so important to investigate, how the research was developed, and how it's gone on to impact the world we live in. And then alongside that podcast, we've developed 2 12-week learning programs for researchers. So one's designed for early career researchers, focusing on a lot of the topics we've discussed today. And then the other one is geared towards mid-career researchers, though early career researchers would benefit as well. And that's all about increasing your impact. And these are free resources that I encourage you to explore. And then lastly, we've got our author services website, which offers support and guidance and tips on copyright, ethics, choosing journals, you know, how to use social media effectively, what to expect during the peer review process, plus many more topics. So definitely take a look there. You'll find a lot of useful material. And that's all for me. So I'm happy to take questions now. And I've also included my email address there in case you have a question that comes up a couple days from now. You're welcome to contact me.
Thanks a lot, Victoria. It was very clear and comprehensive, very great presentation. We have received many questions for you already. So my colleague Victoria is going to read them. If you have other questions, please send them in writing in the Q&A section of GoToWebinar. Victoria from EURAXESS, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Charlotte, and thank you, Victoria with a C, for a wonderful presentation. As Charlotte mentioned, it was very clear, and we have a lot of questions from our audience. We have over 300 people still listening to us today at this point, so they didn't leave us from the beginning, which means a lot about the presentation. I'm going to actually start with asking the questions that were raised at the very beginning, and then I will go one by one until we run out of the time. So the first question is connected to the price. I would like to make a question, asks Monica, more or less how much it costs to publish in open access?
Oh, that's a really tough question because there's a lot of variety within open access. So as I said, I talked about those two different models. You have the pure open access journals, and then you have hybrid journals that allow you to publish open access. That usually is a bit more expensive if you're publishing in a subscription-based journal and you want to publish open access. But within that kind of field of open access journals, the price ranges very widely. I mean, it's really difficult to say it's costs about this much. The other thing is there's different discounts rates for people based in different parts of the world that can apply for those open access fees and different programs. So sorry, I can't give you, a clear number on that, but there is so much variety. And then with different disciplines where there isn't a tradition with open access and not a lot of funding for it, like say arts and humanities, a lot of those journals are fully funded, so authors don't have to pay an APC, because the understanding is that people don't have that kind of support from their funder or from their institution. So what I would suggest is just going and taking a look at some of the journals you're interested in and looking at what the different fees are for the different journals. And in terms of Taylor and Francis, we do have all of our journals listed on a page, so you can go to Taylor and Francis and find all the open access journals, and then you can just kind of look through and see the variation there.
Thank you so much. The next question is connected also to the price, and Isabella asks whether the price by page, for example, should be clear in the website, or is it something that is variable to each paper?
So are you thinking APCs as indicating how many pages? It's a price per page, because it's not necessarily how APCs work. They tend to work for article types. So they'll say, okay, a longer research article would cost this much. A short communication, whether that's a short opinion piece or a case study, would cost this much. So they don't really do it by page numbers at this point in time, at least none of the journals that I'm familiar with.
Thank you. We have another question. Do you have any course related to academic writing style and also other related with edition for future editorial boards?
Oh, that's a good one. Yeah, we actually are just rolling out some courses for writing. What we're doing is approaching institutions about that to set that up. But I'm happy to, if you want to follow up with me after this, I'm happy to provide some information on that. I like the idea of prep for editorial board work, and that is something that I'm thinking about creating, because I know that people are interested in, they want to understand what that trajectory is from, you know, author to peer reviewer to editor. So that is definitely something I'm thinking about creating, but we don't have one course like that now.
Food for thought, right, for the future.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's a good one.
Then we have one listener, one attendee who is asking or saying, I had completed Taylor and Francis Early Career Research Impact Program, but unable to find the proof. Will there be backup copy available within system to retrieve it again?
Ooh, can you follow up with me in my email address? Because I can talk to the team that's responsible for that. I don't know off the top of my head, so I need to talk to the team. So just send me an email after this and I'll look into that.
Yes, please, Arjun, it was your question, so please follow up with Victoria directly. Thank you. Then we have another question from Eva asking, can we include a published article into a monographic publication?
Yeah, I mean, different publishers have different policies, but our policy is that if you are publishing a collection of your own work and you've published all these articles elsewhere, you know, obviously you should always be able to publish your work in a collection of your work. If you're publishing it in like an anthology where it's going to be a lot of different authors, you need to get permission from the original publisher. And it's usually, you know, something that is, you know, given. Sometimes there is a fee, but it's usually the publishers that are paying the fee. It's not the individual person that's paying the fee.
Thank you. Another question comes from Guberni asking, the ethics aspect is crucial because some journals or editors give more relevance to papers with co-authors who publish very often. How to handle this for beginner authors?
Yeah, so I mean, the authorship issue is really interesting there. If I understand your question, and tell me if I'm getting this wrong, you're wondering about the authorship line and how young authors should be thinking about authorship. Is that correct?
Is she or he, you know, is the saying the ethics aspect? That's how he is you know, beginning the question. The ethics aspect is crucial because some journals or editors give more relevance to papers with co-authors who publish very often. How to handle this for beginner authors?
Yeah, I missed the relevance part. That's interesting because I also thought that it was interesting that somebody mentioned something about reason for rejection being a early career researcher. And for most journals, they do try and have a blinded process as much as possible. Not, again, there's different types of peer review that is conducted, and some of those processes are open or single blind. So editors, for the most part, do try their very best to be neutral on this. The other thing is editors usually are really keen to publish early career researchers. I mean, every editorial board meeting I've gone to, they want that new, fresh research, you know, it's new ideas. So it doesn't necessarily match up that somebody who's really well published and, you know, a star in the field is always going to get published. They get rejected too on a regular basis. And those early career researchers oftentimes are kind of publishing the cutting edge research because they're so deeply embedded in the literature and their research. So I know that's not definitely answering your question, but I would just say I'm not sure it's the case, actually. I'm not sure that is.
Thank you so much. Another question that we have is, are there any inherent differences, for example, publication structure, number of pages, research methodology, which are very specific to open access versus non-open access journals?
No. So, I mean, I said no, and then I'm going to backtrack on that. In general, open access is just a model of publication. They're still trying to publish the same material. It's just they want to publish it open. They want everybody to have access to it. However, there is a move to publish more parts of the research process. So rather than limiting folks to just publishing the communication of the research, now there are different journals and different platforms like our F1000 platform that are interested in publishing other parts of the research process. So data notes, data in general, all these different things that you wouldn't normally see in your traditional journal. So in that way, you're seeing different types of content. But in general, you know, open access journals are journals. They're just open.
Thank you. Another question we have from Augustine asking, how important is it to follow instructions for authors in the first submission?
So important. Yeah, especially in the first submission. Yeah, I mean, it saves, number one, it's going to save you time. It's respectful to the editors that have spent years developing their instructions for authors. It is their rule book. They expect you to follow it. So yes, please do. Now, what I will say is at Taylor and Francis, we have format-free submissions. So you don't have to worry about formatting, but you should be using the proper reference style. You should be following their guidelines on, you know, article length and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, please do. I speak for all of our.
Yes. Another question we received from Antonio asking, does open review promote greater transparency about the peer review process?
I would say so. You know, I find it interesting because a lot of people say, oh, but what if the peer reviewers say mean things? I'd say open peer review actually limits bias and limits the occurrence of people misbehaving during the peer review process because it is visible to everyone. So if people are exhibiting bias, you know, that is easily seen, then they will be exposed for being biased. The other thing with the open peer review process is that, for instance, at F1000 Research, they check before they post a peer reviewer's comments. So if there is something super disrespectful or inappropriate, they'll go back to the peer reviewer and say, can you please edit it? Or for instance, if the peer review is too short and isn't actually adding any value or offering any insight. So there is oversight in those systems, but I do think it increases transparency, absolutely.
Thank you. We have a question that was asked by several of our attendees. How do journals ensure a reviewer for my specialty or research?
Yeah, it is really difficult sometimes finding reviewers, but as I said, most journals do try and create an editorial board that is diverse enough that can address all the different types of research that's coming in. But say they start receiving a bunch of research and they're like, who's a specialist in their area? They're probably going to go try and find a specialist in that area to join the board. But there are a lot of tools out there. There's a lot of tools built into the peer review system so the editors can put in keywords and then it'll bring up a list of people that are specialists in that area. And they use their networks oftentimes. You know, if they get a paper in, they'll probably put a word out to a few people and say, do you know anyone that specializes in this? But yeah, it's challenging, and it's challenging to find peer reviewers because people are really busy right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Another question we have from Roberto asking, would you comment about the non-desired consequences of a peer review process?
Non-desired consequences. So that could be almost anything. Could be rejection. Can we open up the microphone so they can ask? No, we can't. Well, I'd say that, I mean, some of the consequences of peer review that can be a bit frustrating for people is when they feel that the peer reviewer isn't giving them honest feedback in a sense, like they're, you know, maybe pointing them in a direction that they don't want to go, or they are not giving useful feedback. Sometimes peer reviewers give really problematic feedback. But what I would say in those instances, in that piece, is the only thing you can do is be the most professional person and just address each issue. And if they're, you know, have put something in their comments that is absolutely inappropriate, just ignore it and move on. And you can always send a separate note to the editor saying, listen, I didn't know how to take this comment, so I'm just ignoring it and moving on. Again, it's all about being detailed, professional, and, you know, as clear as you can be.
Yes.
But there's not much we can do with rejection. I guess that's the other negative outcome.
Yes, exactly. Try again, right? Try and try.
Yeah, exactly. Number 2 on your list. Just keep
exactly.
moving. Yeah.
Thank you. We have another comment and question from Sandra. She's saying, I already published my research results at some conferences. Can I write the same content at my dissertation? And she's also asking to tell us more about self-plagiarism.
Yeah, okay. So here's the thing about conferences. If what you presented at a conference is published and it has a DOI, so it's got an identifying, you know, identifier to it, then you can't republish that content. Now, this gets a little bit tricky because sometimes people do extended abstracts at conferences. I know that's really popular in a lot of conferences and they are published. So if you do want to further develop that extended abstract, that is possible, but again, you need to be adding something new. And sometimes that's hard to do if you've got an extended abstract. But what I would say in that case is contact the editor, send that extended abstract, tell them what you're thinking about doing to change it or, you know, to add value to that, and ask them if they would be interested. That's the best thing you can do in that case. And then the self-plagiarism, it's a really tricky one because I think we all know when we're just regurgitating material that we've already worked, you know, or published with before. And I appreciate that everyone's under so much pressure to publish more and more articles every year. But basically, self-plagiarism or salami slicing is when you are using material so much, so many times that when your new article, it has absolutely nothing new in it because you've already published on that. You know, it's already been there. Now, the flip side of self-plagiarism is just making sure that you do cite any work that you have published previously because you don't want that to show up. But when I was talking about that, you know, salami slicing, that's what I meant, is when you take the salami and you cut it up into so many little pieces just to try and get as many pieces as you can out of it, even though it's all the same thing.
Thank you. I think we have time for a few more questions. Another one from Andre is, can a cover letter make a change in the decision of the editor?
Yeah, I mean, some journals are moving away from cover letters. I always think impact statements are great. Just a short letter saying why is your research important? Why should they be interested in publishing? It can be really short. I don't think it hurts. You know, you're your best advocate. So again, not every journal accepts cover letters in this day and age now that we've moved to kind of the digital realm. But if they do, definitely be an advocate for yourself, be honest about the contribution. But, you know, I think it is good to say why this research is important and why it needs to be published.
Thank you so much. Moving on to a next question from Sergio. He's saying, I have a nice paper with a nice analysis with nice co-authors, but still I can't get my paper accepted in the journal I of 10. Any tip to really improve the selling points?
Yeah, well, it's hard because I don't know what the paper is. So can't get published in, what was that, ISN?
IF 10.
Oh, okay, impact factor. Okay, all right. Yeah, I mean, that's tough. As I say, you just really need to have your list of the journals that you would be happy being published in, and you just need to go through that list. And you might not be in your top 5, and that is a shame. It's frustrating. I agree. But the only thing you can do is take the good comments, the ones that you find really useful from that peer review process, and apply them to your paper. Continue to work your paper, continue to share your paper with as many people as you can. Again, get as much feedback as you can, because maybe you're missing something. Maybe there's something that, you know, there's a little kernel there that needs to be polished up a little bit and you're just not seeing it. So I really think it's about getting a lot of feedback. I mean, research is kind of a collective enterprise. So pull on that wide international network that you hopefully have, and try and get as much feedback as you can.
Wonderful. And our last question for today would be by Ines, who is asking, in my case, I'm going to publish a paper of my doctoral thesis. Is it recommended to be done by myself, or is it recommended to be done with my advisor so both names will go in the paper?
Did your advisor help with the writing or the research? I mean, what I would say is I would go back to that. I'd go back to that note about authorship. If your advisor was your, co-author, following those criteria that I listed, then it would be appropriate. If you're just trying to put their name there to hopefully have different outcomes, but they didn't really contribute to the paper, then I would say that's probably it. I don't think it would make a difference. And it wouldn't be appropriate because they're not truly an author. So it really is about what kind of contribution that person made to the paper.
Thank you so much, Victoria, for answering all of these questions. And we have many, many more, but unfortunately we are already short of time and we won't be able to answer them, but hopefully we'll be able to get back to all of you at one point. And now I will leave the floor to Charlotte to close up the webinar. Thank you.
On behalf of EURAXESS LAC and EURAXESS North America, we would like to thank you very much, Victoria. The presentation was great and many questions already. We would like to thank Taylor and Francis also for its collaboration. The good news is that this series is continuing in the next months. We had many questions today about ethics. So we will have the next webinar next month on the 20th of April, exactly about research and publishing ethics. So stay tuned, register, it's already opened. Thanks a lot, everybody, and see you next month.